One of the fun developments of television streaming services these days is that you get a summary of the events leading up to the episode that you're about to watch. If you've been away from a show for a while, this little reminder can be really helpful. And as I returned to the story of the Israelites in Egypt this week, a little bit of recap was really helpful for me to understand the story of Passover. According to the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish community first migrated into Egypt when Joseph moved his family there during a severe famine in his homeland of Canaan. And for years, they lived in Egypt in harmony. But as their Jewish population grew, the Egyptians began to see them as a threat. After Joseph died, a particularly nasty Pharaoh ordered the enslavement of the Jewish people and the systematic drowning of their firstborn sons in the Nile River. I had forgotten this critically important setup for the story of Passover and the background of the hero. Pharaoh ordered the drowning of all these firstborn sons of the Jews. Of course, one of those doomed infants was set in a raft among the reeds in a river and rescued by Pharaoh's own daughter. He was given the name Moses, which means one who is pulled out. When he reached adulthood, Moses became aware of his true identity and the full nature of the Egyptians' brutal treatment of his fellow people. The story says Moses was so angry he killed an Egyptian slave master and then fled to the Sinai Peninsula, where he lived as a shepherd for about 40 years. And then we get to the story that's more familiar, and the story of Passover. One day, Moses received a commandment from God to return to Egypt to free his people from bondage. Along with his brother Aaron, Moses approached that Pharaoh several times, explaining that the God of his people requested 3 days of leave so that they could celebrate a feast in the wilderness. Pharaoh, he made this request 10 times, and of course, Pharaoh rejected the 10 times. Each time, God unleashed 10 increasingly harsh plagues on the Egyptians, including turning the Nile River into blood. We forget that the Nile River is the source of life in that point. Diseased livestock, boils, hailstorms, and 3 days of darkness. The plagues culminated, of course, in the slaying of every firstborn son by an avenging angel. This plague was so harsh that it even killed the firstborn among the livestock. The Israelites, however, were warned in advance to mark the frames of their doors with lamb's blood so that this angel of death would recognize and pass over each of the Jewish households. They were spared. Terrified, these Egyptians finally convinced their ruler to release the Israelites, and Moses quickly led them out of Egypt. It's quite the saga. Today, the most common observance of Passover is a Seder. I appreciate Michelle's description of Michael's family's experience of that through many different iterations. The other piece of Passover remembrance that some of us are familiar with is not eating leavened bread. Observant Jews will remove any food products that are leavened before this time of Passover and abstain from eating leavened bread for the duration. The tradition says that the Hebrews fled Egypt too quickly for their bread to rise. It may also be that matzah is a lot lighter and easier to carry through the desert. Now, for a long time, especially in the Christian world, Jews have been misunderstood as kind of obsessing about these rules. And it's true that following some rules is important. But those rules have helped a community stay connected through some horrible adversity. They give a sense of identity over thousands of years of exile and persecution and some theological shifts. Another common thread in the Jewish community is storytelling. Most of the major holidays correspond to a story of the Jewish people's history. The stories remind them of who they are and the laws that they follow to create sacred community. There's so much beautiful history and tradition there. But one thing remains confusing to me. What is Judaism? Obviously, there's Judaism, the religion, but a lot of people who consider themselves Jewish don't believe in that religion at all. Some call Judaism a race. Even the United States Supreme Court classified it this way in the 1980s for discrimination purposes. Yet people of all sorts of racial and ethnic backgrounds can become Jews. Some say it's a culture or an ethnic group. But Jewish culture isn't really monolithic. It looks different in different places. And a lot of that culture is shared with folks from the Middle East, beyond Judaism. The answer to the question seems to depend very much on who you ask. If you ask someone who is Jewish themselves, they are likely to have a very strong opinion to the right answer to that question. I am not Jewish. And I know several Jew-yous among us who have very strong opinions about this debate. I am not going anywhere near suggesting an answer to that question. For today, I do want to draw our attention to why that question is so powerful. For one, it has real ethical implications, as Jewish people have been persecuted again and again and again. Also, it matters because the Jewish community has asked this very question of themselves for thousands of years. Who are we as a people? Who is inside this group? Who is not? Who draws those lines? What does it mean that God chose us as a people? How does the way we understand ourselves match up with how we live in the world with other groups? Of course, Jews aren't the only religious community to raise these questions. In Christian or in Unitarian language, this whole line of question is called ecclesiology. A few years ago, I took a whole doctoral level course in the topic from a teacher who had made a career out of asking this question and answering its various permutations. Who are we as a community, and how does that reflect what we know about the sacred? For UUs, the key word in answering those questions is covenant. We usually point to a very particular covenant that still shapes us today. It was the Cambridge Platform. In 1648, the government of Massachusetts called all those kind of Protestant startups that were all a little bit different and a little bit chaotic together to figure out how they would relate to each other and relate to the government. And they came up with a Cambridge Platform. It states that every congregation has the right to choose their own minister and control their own property and finances. Every congregation would select its leaders and choose the criteria by which they would admit or expel members. It created this structure that we still live by today. If you've been around Tapestry long enough, you know that's basically how we're run. According to the Cambridge Platform, church members offer themselves in faith as they voluntarily consent to, quote, mutual church covenant. And that word mutual shows up over and over. It talks about mutual edification, mutual duty, mutual covenant. It says that members have power one over another mutually. That's very strong language. In joining a congregation, members sign a covenant to be part of that community. I started this sermon talking about Jewish people and history, and if we're honest about covenant, it isn't something that our Puritan or congregational roots created. Covenant is a concept that traces all the way back to our earliest religious predecessors, those followers of Moses. Here in America, members of the Puritans and congregational churches committed themselves to each other with God as the foundation of that commitment. Covenant has always been an understanding that invoked God. Some of us are really uncomfortable with invoking God in our promises to one another. Some of us find it totally fine. Our beliefs today are way too diverse, though, to be summed up with the G word. And that's okay. But the question remains, I think a question that we have to chew on is, how do we acknowledge and make up for that God component of covenant that was important in our history? It's one thing for me to stand up here and talk about it. It's another thing entirely for you to identify that thing that kind of used to so easily be called God, that sense of mystery, that awe, that deepest ground of being, to identify that and bring that into relationships. You may not be able to name it, but feeling it is a very good start. So I got a lot of help writing this sermon and answering this question of who are we religiously? We recently heard from several Tapestry members of part of the Pledge campaign, and they told us why they support Tapestry. One person spoke about arriving at Tapestry during some pretty major life transitions. She found here an opportunity to explore new ideas and to try some things on and to chart a new course. Her experience reminds me that Unitarian Universalism inherits a history of radicals and free thinkers and self-identified heretics. Those rich, diverse points of view weave together a community of curiosity and seeking. This community embraces wisdom of the past, certainly, but we have no intention of stopping there. We seek authentic insight for our own heart and mind in our own time. We're a community of seekers. Every Sunday, we covenant to seek truth in love. That's part of how we are together. Also, just last week, Bruce and John gave a stunning account of how Unitarian Universalism embraced them as a gay couple over their 50 years of relationship. It's been a refuge where they could find community and be their whole authentic selves. And this is another important part of who we have been together. For a very long time, we leaned forward in our social point of view. We have been far from perfect, but still we've aimed to honor and to welcome marginalized groups. In asking who we are, who we seek to be, part of the answer is a community that offers a welcome that's so complete that we open ourselves to being changed in the process. Bruce and John also talked about it being a place where they identify their values and help put those values into action. There are a lot of places to do that, if we're honest. It's possible to sit down with a pile of books on ethics and philosophy. It's possible to sit down by yourself and write checks to nonprofit organizations. But what we aim for here is an opportunity to do that together, to help heal the world together. I'm reminded of the saying, If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. It may be a little overused at this point, but it's good. With regard to growing our spirit and healing the world, we're in the business of going far together. Finally, in this pledge campaign, Jennifer talked to us about it being a place, Tapestry being a place where her daughter Lila could learn about spirituality and be a part of a loving community. And this is something that faith communities do that is easy to forget about, and something that's increasingly rare in our culture. Where else do 40-somethings play pub trivia with people in their 80s? Where else do 5-year-olds build friendships with adults outside of their family? Where else do we get to blend together the fresh perspective of youth and the age of wisdom? We sometimes forget how special and rare that multi-generational opportunity is. That's part of who we are, passing down our values and learning from the inspiration of younger minds. That's a whole lot of answer to the question, who are we religiously? As we wrap up this exploration of how we are together, this look at ecclesiology, I want to remember and remind us that relationships don't happen in a vacuum. Our relationships impact each other like gears in a great big social machine. An unhealthy working environment can invite chaos into home relationships. And a loving, supportive partnership enables us to bring compassion and courage to the world outside. So I ask, how can you bring the genuine love that you experience outside these walls in here with you on Sunday mornings to share? We are not perfect, individually or as a community. We can learn and grow from whatever goodness you've got going on out there. And I hope from time to time the relationships we nurture here inform the rest of your life. How would you like to take what you find here out into the world? I hope that the support of curiosity, the mutuality, the sharing, the grace that you sometimes experience here is something that you can take into other relationships. Maybe at the end of it all, the answer to that question of who are we is about growing together in love. Amen.